And a very good morning to you. Happy holidays. We're live in London and you're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, two intellectual heavyweights slug it out in front of the microphone for the next hour, sharing their views on the week and indeed the year's biggest stories. David Bodanis and Charles Hecker. Welcome to Monocle Radio. David, what have you spotted?
I see that there's a new version of Around the World in 80 Days with David Tennant travelling where David Niven barely dared before.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And how about you, Chuck? What's on your radar?
I think we're going to take a closer look at Russia's alleged shooting down of an Azerbaijan Airlines aircraft and ask some questions about the nature of dictatorship.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Andrew Muller brings us his take from 2024.
We learned basically that the United States is once again going to more or less write the Friday What We Learned monologue for us for the foreseeable future.
Plus, we hear from our editorial director, Tyler Brule, who's out and about live in St Moritz. It's the 29th of December, 2024, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you. A very happy Christmas or happy Hanukkah or whatever happiness you've been experiencing for the last few days. Chuck, how was your Christmas?
I've been experiencing an awful lot of happiness over the past few days, and I think I need a little bit of a break from all of this vacationing. But all in all, it's been a tasty, warm, and relatively fun holiday period.
How delicious. How about you, David?
I found that Christmas puddings last forever. I had thought that Christmas puddings that were in the back of the refrigerator or the back of the cellar or somewhere in the back of beyond with not being eaten growing up as a nice Jewish boy in Chicago. What did I know about Christmas? But with my Anglican wife, I found that you can make food that lasts forever.
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. We have Christmas puddings that date back 3 years.
Yeah, we also then do takeaways for things that have taste. But the conjunction is very good.
It's not so bad. I think the point of Christmas pudding is it's supposed to sort of completely knock you off the table by the time you've been sort of like turkeyed out. Was there turkey around the table?
There was turkey for breakfast, turkey for lunch. If you want to come over, Emma, for turkey, we have a couple pieces of large turkeys for you.
We're doing all right as well with our turkeys, but thank you very much indeed. Was there turkey in the Hecker table?
I have had the famous Crouch End vegan Christmas.
Oh, for God's sake.
Which is now for several years running. And I initially insulted my hosts by saying that we had a mushroom loaf, but I was very politely reminded that it was mushroom Wellington, which of course is much more fancy. And it was actually delicious. A little bit off-piste, but went down a treat.
Let's head to the Engadine, where our editorial director, Tyler Brule, is out and about. A very happy holidays to you, Tyler.
Yes, belated Merry Christmas, Emma. You can hear the crunch, crunch, crunch of snow underfoot. It is minus 12 in the Engadine. Absolutely cloudless and just gorgeous. And we've had a run of weather, which has just been amazing. And it sort of continues well past New Year's Day.
How blissful. It sounds like you're having an excellent workout at the same time.
Exactly. I mean, that's normally the case. I'm not in studio. You catch me out for a little bit of a Sunday constitutional, which is exactly what's happening right now.
And do I take it that you too, like Chuck Hager, had a Crouch End vegan Christmas?
Well, up here it was a bit of an alpine combo. This was the year of giving the Estonian kitchen, at least at home, a break. And it just happened that down the valley in the village of Silvaplana, the mayor has married an Estonian woman. She's also co-running the hotel. They brought lots of Estonians into the kitchen. We only found this out recently. And we had the Estonian chefs do Christmas for us, which was great. And we just sort of, bopped along in the Suzuki, picked it all up, and it worked out a treat.
How delicious. It sounds absolutely heavenly. Now, I know that around your when you get a moment of sofa time, and I know that your column this week has said that you've had precious little sofa time during Christmas, there is often that opportunity to watch a little bit of television. And I know that the Nelson household at least had various family members who just sat and shouted abuse at the telly all week. I know that you're quite a fan of passing comment. Have you caught anything that made you laugh, or anything that you've noticed? I know that news channels are sometimes a favourite.
Well, yeah, there's been those moments, of course, we've tried to stream various things, but I haven't found anything we've fallen in love with. Didn't mind Bad Sisters, actually. That I'm a bit late to that party. So a little bit of a tour through Ireland. If anyone has seen that series, I mean, did they really just do they shoot it over 5 years? Because I've never seen so many sunny days in Ireland. Every single day, it's glorious sunshine on that program, which is a little bit remarkable. For the times I've been in Ireland, it never looks like that. But I thought, how do they actually make that series come off? Aside from streaming, though, I've made a comment in my column today, which is just the need, and I know, as you said, this is definitely a discussion in the Nelson household. It's time to either pack it in with some of these rolling news channels, or it's a moment for massive rethink and reinvention.
Indeed, it's time for proper telly. And I know, David Bodanis, you were saying that you've been your idea about how the world has shrunk to a small screen in the last few years. I mean, the fact is that David, I'll ask you this: what kind of world are we experiencing on our screens at the moment?
I think what we really want is community. And it's really weird. You see on an airplane people viciously not looking at each other, touching each other, watching warm romantic comedies, where usually by the end of Act 3, the whole community gets together and they're really sharing. We go on the TGV really fast to go to a place where we could be ourselves. We pay a huge amount of money and work really hard jobs to find the neighborhood where we can be cozy and we can enact things. It's hard to be 100% present. Screens bring us to that world. You know, they say that poets aren't absent-minded. They're present-minded, but just somewhere else.
And Tyler, this ties into a couple of things that you've picked up in the last few months, isn't it? The idea of how community can actually be defined by the small shop and the fact that people are on a train not talking to each other. I mean, we talk an awful lot about the creation of communities in small shops, but this is something that you've noticed this year, isn't it?
Well, it's something we've been banging on about for ages. I can think about just being up in St. Moritz. We had this amazing hardware store called Eichholzer, which I'm still sort of mourning the death of. This is one of these 3-story affairs. If you wanted lamp oil, if you needed a cowbell, if you needed a cow back scratcher, if you needed anti-slip rugs or anti-slip pads for your rugs, they had everything. And there were 2 or 3 women who were working at the checkout, or not even the checkout, just say the counter in the shop. And they knew everyone in the village, and they knew all of your needs. And this shop could sort of fix anything for you. And it's gone. And recently also, within Zurich as well, down the street from our headquarters, Blattner, an amazing hardware store, gone because they just said, running a hardware business, they just could not pay the rents that were being demanded on that part of the street. And again, you see this complete evaporation of community. You see a pillar of the neighborhood gone, and voila, we have another nail bar.
Tyler, and that's a very serious point you make, but I must seize on one thing that you said is, how often have you found yourself in need of a cow back scratcher?
Oh, listen, more than ever. Maybe after this year or the year ahead, it's exactly what I need. And I'm actually amazed by the array of cow back scratchers that are available. You can get sort of the wheel version. I don't know if you've seen that one. That's sort of a big sort of brush. It looks like you could sort of clean bottles with it, but this is something just when the cow sort of presses against it, then it sort of springs to life and it's automated. Of course, you've got the more analog versions as well. I'm quite an expert on this topic.
Well, we've noticed on our little train trips in Switzerland that cows in Switzerland clearly enjoy a phenomenally high quality of life. I don't know if you've ever been on a train and noticed those sort of open plan. They look like a hoof house, but they're for cows. And they have these phenomenally luxurious glass-fronted sheds that the cows can basically luxuriate in. And we were traipsing around some back village in England this year during Christmas, wondering what everybody does when they live out in the middle of nowhere, and notice the sort of abhorrent status of farms. Yet in Switzerland, the treatment of the cow is something akin to sort of a demigod.
Yes, and actually, I will send you some pictures a bit later, because we were down the valley in Schanf yesterday, another wonderful village, and just on the way out of town, we passed this amazing farm, exactly as you're saying, a bunch of, I believe they're probably Scottish provenance, one of the very shaggy cows, big horns, sort of ginger, and I'm trying to think, what are they called? They're not Aberdeens, are they? Anyway, absolutely beautiful, but sort of in Swiss style as well. As you know, Emma, strange things also happen with hair color in the Alps, because these small villages, either they get sort of the end supply from Wella or from L'Oreal, but you always see the strangest hair combinations, and we've discussed this before. Also, men and women of a certain age having the exact same haircuts, because they probably can only do 3 haircuts in many alpine salons. And then there's a lot of sort of blue, a lot of purple, both on the men and women. And then what was interesting about these cows is so they weren't just ginger, but there were sort of lovely grays, wonderful browns, fawn colors. Anyway, I'll send you pictures later.
Thank you so much, because actually I'm one of the people on earth who will actually deeply appreciate a beautiful picture of a lovely cow.
But don't go strange with the well hair dye on New Year's Eve, please.
I'll try not to dress myself up as a cow. Chuck, any cows in East London?
Well,
on just nail bars.
There are, frankly, Shoreditch has transformed itself from a neighborhood known for sort of clubbing and barfy teenagers late at night to a place that now is entirely filled with coffee shops and nail salons. Every single street, quite literally, in my part of East London has at least one nail salon on it. Given that we all have 10 fingers and 10 toes, there's quite a few to go through. But nail salons everywhere you look.
I was in Shoreditch a couple of weeks ago and was astonished by how it was a normal working day, yet all the coffee shops were full and there weren't people on laptops. What are these people doing, Chuck?
I guess they're either having a coffee before they get their nails done or they're having a coffee after they get their nails done. Because getting your nails done, of course, is exhausting, and so you need a little bit of a pick-me-up, before or after. And clearly, if one lives in Shoreditch or is traveling through Shoreditch, the two go hand in hand.
Tyler, how many nail bars and coffee shops are appearing in St Moritz? Or actually, what are in the shop windows this year in St Moritz? Because they're usually quite spectacular. They go a bit baroque.
Oh, well, absolutely. There's definitely a baroque moment. Very good light array brought to you by Badgerott's Palace. Listen, you might sort of think that the fur coat is dead, not up here. Well, the fur is dead, obviously, but there's a sort of a clandestine version of the coat. So once upon a time, we would have maybe just a fox or a lynx or any number of sort of furry animals that would be cut into maybe a nice sort of A-line shape for a coat or a cape. Now everything is sheared, so it sort of looks like maybe you could have picked it up at H&M, but you just get maybe, of course, half a meter away, and you can tell that this is, I don't know, whatever, 12, 15 grams worth of mink or ermine or beaver, whatever it may be, and yes, so the fur shops are doing perfectly fine here, and plenty of fur in all the windows.
Wonderful. What else from St Moritz this year?
Pardon me, I missed that, sorry.
What else has taken your fancy this year when it comes to either things that you've spotted or indeed things that you're seeing on your walk this morning?
Well, of course, a lot of dogs and a lot of dog fashion as well. It is -12, so of course, young pups, they don't just need a Monocle jacket, they need also maybe a hoodie to go with it. I'm watching this right now, also with full booties, small poodle running up and down a slope. And aside from that, I think one of the interesting things is just, we can talk about all of the high-end luxury, but I think a real interesting sense of entrepreneurship. Younger people, we've talked about this topic of people staying in the mountains, not sitting in nail bars, but actually maybe opening coffee shops. Maybe nail bars are to come. I don't know. We don't quite have that same strange property racket up here in the mountains with too many barber shops and too many nail bars. There is definitely a premium on real estate up here. So no funny business going on. But what is interesting to see, though, is just younger people remaining in the mountains, feeling committed to the mountains, maybe not looking for that draw of the big city, and being sort of proper young entrepreneurs. One place just to maybe point out, a place called Belmont in St Moritz, wonderful gentleman, Silvano Vitellini, and he's running his cafe and fantastic bar 365 days a year, open from 7:30 in the morning. And this is a real commitment to keeping villages open because, of course, we know that the cycle of alpine resorts has been a complicated one, particularly, of course, when you have very sort of seasonal a seasonal workforce, open from December and then closing at March. The village goes dark for a few months, then sort of reopens in June and sort of shutters again at the beginning of September. But this idea that these are places where you want to be actually all year round, and you realize the majesty of these places, in November, also in April as well. And so this idea of sort of younger people remaining in place in the mountains, setting up their own shops, I think is something super admirable. And at the same time, also a nice amenity as well.
And David, just bringing you in, do we have are we looking at people now, what Tyler's describing, as people are taking one look at cities and going, actually, I'm not entirely sure that it's got as much to offer as it perhaps did a few years ago? Because cities are getting tougher and harder, aren't they, especially for young people trying to make their way?
There's kind of a trade-off. A lot of people get frustrated with cities and they want to go somewhere else, but then they come for a visit. And they come for a visit and they go to a friend's party. And at the friend's party, they see somebody who they have no chance whatsoever of meeting in their little small town. So they come back and they pay an incredible percentage of their income for rent. And people keep on coming in. The other big reason is the age of marriage. In New York City, 2 generations ago, you come in at age 21 or 22, you meet somebody, you get married, your life is over, so you move to New Jersey. In London, you come in at 21 or 22, and you hang around and other people come in at 21. And as the years go on, it keeps on piling in. So it's that chance of, at a party, there could be a friend of a friend, who knows where romance is. Or there could be a friend of an acquaintance, and you go to a networking event, and suddenly a job comes in because somebody hints about something. So on the one hand, it's awful for many people. You walk by parties on Primrose Hill, people are having sangria in the summer, and you think, I want friends. Where's that blanket? How come I'm not in a romantic comedy? On the other hand, the chance that it sometimes works, and it could be there around the corner, keeps a lot of people living on the crummy edge of big cities.
That's the whole problem, isn't it, Tyler, that people end up on the crummy edge of big cities and then suddenly decide that actually that wonderful person that David was talking about is going to walk through the door of the cafe that you run anyway.
Yeah, very, very, very good chance. And also, if you're in sort of, a smaller pool as well, this being sort of in one of many alpine villages in the Engadine Valley, listen, you have sort of no choice in that small pool. But to sort of confront yourself with people. Also, but the good thing, though, is you also have the ebb and flow of a lot of tourists as well. So, if you don't sort of like, the look of the local gene pool, then there's a lot of people who are waiting in and out for long weekends, or they might be staying up for the season. So, yeah, of course, maybe, Mr. or Mrs. Wright could just be sort of one Gulfstream landing away. And that's one of the fascinating things. It is prime. I have to go look on Flight Radar, but there's probably... Samaden Airport is probably, after Geneva and Zurich, must be the busiest airport. Now, Switzerland doesn't have a ton of airports, but it has at least 2 big airports certainly in Geneva and Zurich. I don't think Basel counts because actually it's sitting in France, but it's a joint venture. That's another story. But it is incredible just watching the aircraft fly in and out of here. And also where they're coming from. Not to mention, and you would like this, as would your son, the amount of aircraft that have a non-registered flight plan as well. So it doesn't say where they're taken off from. It also doesn't say where they're landing. Of course, when they're inbound, you can see the aircraft, but it doesn't. It does not even identifying its final destination. But there are, yes, a lot of Global Expresses, Falcons, Gulfstreams coming in from all over the world.
We're never going to get anything done for the rest of the day, are we? We're just going to be looking at this airport.
Talk about looking at planes, exactly.
Look at planes. What lies in store for 2025? Well, how are you starting it? Is there one of those wonderful moments where there's going to be a large party and all the young people of the Engadine will suddenly find love without having to go into Zurich?
Well, listen, I'm already sort of beyond what's going to happen New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. Thinking much more about getting back to work, certainly back, at the desk in Zurich from the 6th. And January is going to be, I would say, very Europe-based. We've got a major project in this current issue of the Entrepreneurs, where we've been looking actually at entrepreneurship in Austria. We'll be doing something of scale also with Austria, and this is with the Department of Economy, the group that looks at inward investment and innovation in Austria. So we're doing something quite significant in Osaka with them for the kickoff of Expo. So there's a Vienna moment at the start of the year. There's quite a bit of Paris, obviously. anyone listening, anyone who's got kids, you don't want them filing nails, but you want them serving coffees. We are on the hiring hunt right now for our new space on Rue Bachemont in Paris. So that's going to be opening at the beginning of February. So there's going to be a lot of time sort of just, I think, spent in that new facility. Testing mics. There's going to be a wonderful radio studio. I don't know if we could ever tempt you onto Eurostar to do a little tour of Monocle on Sunday in Paris. I know we need a significant cattle prod to make that happen.
That would be terrible. I can't imagine. Can't imagine.
So that's happening, and then of course just there's definitely a London moment at the end of the month, but it's a Europe moment in January, and then properly back out of the road. Long haul A350 777 style from the start of February.
Tyler, thank you. Well, I won't need a cattle prod, but I might take a back scratcher. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle on Sunday, and the happiest of New Year's to you and yours.
Thanks, Emma.
You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Round the table, David Bodanis and Charles Heckert. Now, for context, these are two men who you hear a lot on the radio, but they are very good at writing about politics, political theory, geopolitics, leadership. And I was interested in looking at 2024 from the point of leaders. Your book, David, has talked about how to be a leader in a nasty world. And you've talked in your book, Zero Sum, Chuck, about how Putin, possibly one of the most devastating leaders to have sort of trodden this earth, at least in the last half century. The good and bad examples of leadership. And we've had an awful lot of elections this year where many countries have just kicked out their previous leaders and gone for whoever is in the opposition. What have you learned in 2024, David, about leadership and the way that the world is run nowadays?
I can't begin to emphasize how far I am from being an expert on this. I sit in a little room in North London. On the other hand, I have interviewed and spoken to and hung out with a lot of different places. There seem to be two possible main ways to do leadership. One is the Russian way. And sadly, it works really, really well. Strong, emphatic instruction. In the short term, it works well. It has many, many powers. People are terrified. They do what you want. Communication can go very quickly in one direction. It also touches on something primal in many human beings. There's often an urge to kowtow to a powerful leader. Even in mild liberal countries, we often say, "My lawyer, he's a Rottweiler." We really like that. We talk about somebody really winning an argument, putting down somebody else. So there's a power to that, and that's an equilibrium which I talk a lot about in the Art of Fairness book. There's another equilibrium, which is where somebody's fair but firm. Totally soft doesn't work. Nice guys really do finish last. You sort of become a doormat if you agree to everything. But there's an intermediate level where somebody's fair but firm. When I ask people, can you succeed without being a jerk? Almost everybody says, no, you can't. With the exception of, and everybody mentions one mentor who is nice or who is, again, fair but firm. Franklin Roosevelt's one example there. George Marshall, the head of the U.S. Army, with somewhat great effectiveness, keeping an intermediate away. Britain versus Germany in World War II, for example. Britain had many alliances. In the Battle of Britain, there were great British pilots. There were pilots from the Czech lands and Poland and South Africa and all over the place. They were drawn to it. The Luftwaffe didn't want such a thing. So there can be advantages to cooperation, being open, fairness, all that sort of stuff. But it's subtle and it's really hard to do. And what 2024 showed is it's too hard. It's too hard. Modern media makes it difficult. I don't want to say impossible, but Ms. Harris did not present a winning case, unfortunately.
No. So, Chuck, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, can you succeed without being a jerk?
One of the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to leadership in 2024, especially across this broad spectrum of elections that we've had, where we've had some leaders turfed out, some leaders reelected, some leaders returning to office after a bit of a vacation, you might say, is that I think the greatest trait a leader can possess is knowing when it's time to go. And, in the discussion of term limits, the discussion of age limits, and in the private sector as well, when CEOs should step down or when they should stay in office, and when they're turfed out disruptively. I think this is one of the greatest things, and this is a skill that President Putin sorely lacks. There really is no mechanism for presidential transition in Russia. We've only had one. And actually, I'm not telling the truth. We've had two because, of course, Putin and Medvedev switched spots once. But the only other transition that we had was from Yeltsin to Putin, and that was essentially a coronation rather than a presidential transition. And President Putin has rewritten the constitution to allow himself an almost limitless, we will all be too old to be on the radio while he is still president of Russia. So, it's time for some leaders to go. And in fact, it's time for some leaders who are still coming back for them to step down as well. We're going to have to live through 4 very, very interesting years in the United States. Fasten your seatbelts. We'll see what happens to India. We'll see what happens to China. We'll see what happens to Brazil. We'll see how the presidential transition in Mexico pans out. And we will have presidential elections, or at least prime ministerial elections, in Canada almost immediately following the new year.
I wonder whether one thing we learned this year is that age and power do not bring humility and wisdom. Because we look at, Trump coming back. Putin is how old now?
70-something.
70-something. We have Xi Jinping, who's going nowhere. But also we had Joe Biden, who one would have thought would have been one of those leaders who recognised a moment and recognised the greater need of his country, and yet it didn't happen. David?
I think there are a couple of things were going on. One is that the people around him had everything to lose by telling the truth. Their access to power would instantly disappear. This happens whenever somebody's weak. Churchill's second term as prime minister, the people around him, they desperately knew he didn't deserve to be prime minister, even though they loved him. It was hard to say that because also they would lose a lot of power. The other one is self-awareness. Biden 30 years ago would have assessed someone like him now much very clearly. The sad thing is when you're going in and out of clarity, you lose your ability to assess well. That's why you need things like you guys were saying, term limits, outside contributions. The big thing is the famous decent person's view of politics, that if you're on top, that's good. If you're not on top, that's also okay. When it's winner takes all, when you have to be on top or else you're in a terrible position and your supporters are in a terrible position, then people stay too long.
And what position does decency retain nowadays? Because one of the old adages is when you are, for example, dealing with a crisis, something that threatens to overwhelm you professionally, like your organisation or your reputation, the general consensus in terms of how you communicate it to the outside world is don't start blaming, don't start saying poor me. You say when they go low, we go high, the Michelle Obama expression. Did we see in 2024 that moment when actually decency and positive rhetoric was thumped out of the arena by anger and greed and sort of vitriol? That seems to be the winning narrative at the moment.
There seemed to be. We can go back to Mr. Go ahead.
No. I'm eager to hear what you have to say. I was just sort of grateful to Emma. Thank you for raising the most important issue of knowing when it's time to step down. And I've got a picture of Putin on my laptop screen at the moment, so he's sort of living in my head rent free this morning. But you're right. The clearest example of a leader understanding or trying to understand or being forced to understand when it's time to sit down was Joe Biden. David, back to you. Sorry.
Back to you on the idea of whether whether decency got a very bloody nose this year.
Sure. I would go back to Mr. Freud. There's different parts of the brain.
Not everybody would agree with you on that path, but go for it.
Somebody once said Freud was right about penis envy, wrong about who gets it. Different parts.
I think you've just broken Chuck.
It's too early in the morning.
Different parts of the brain. You can think of it as a child, parent, and adult. Social media, and especially Twitter, which is a name I slightly prefer to what Musk uses. But the idea of Twitter, it brings out the worst primeval parts of our brain, the underlying id, the sheer desire. And humans are, to use a fancy word, mimetic animals. We copy what's going on around us. If you have a more decent environment, many people who are caught between awful indulgence versus being the grown-up and responsible, they'll be grown-up and responsible. For several decades after World War II, all the grown-ups Democrats knew what happens if you use nasty language. They really knew the consequences well. And a lot of people who had used unpleasant language before instantly stopped when they saw what it could lead to. But then time passes and you can let this little nasty bit come out. Someone like Musk and someone like Trump, Trump is surrounded by one of the largest armies the world's ever seen, a huge U.S. Navy and Air Force. He's like a really rich kid who is allowed to be a thug at school because nobody will come back at him and stuff. So you can bring out this sort of awful behavior. Suppose literally a weak child did this, or one of the relatively small countries on Earth did it. They couldn't get away with it. So it's coming out and being magnified from a big part. There will be a reaction against it. Indeed, the number of American voters who were against it were pretty substantial. Alas, not enough.
Chuck?
David raises a very interesting point here about Trump and his rhetoric and his manner and his conduct as a candidate and as a president and now as president-elect. And that is that he is governing, or is threatening for the time being, to govern by bullying. And by forcing people to do things that they don't want and to bend to his will. And I'm looking at a piece in the New York Times right now with a headline that says, Mexico, betting Trump is bluffing on tariffs, sees an opportunity. And this is a story, a really nice sort of weekend analytical piece that's also very well illustrated with some very, very beautiful photographs of the town, the city of Monterrey. And this is a story about how Mexico is trying to navigate Trump's bullying of his neighbors, both Mexico and Canada, by threatening to impose crushing tariffs on the goods and services that they export to the United States. And Mexico is trying to play clever here by saying, listen, you can beat up on China or you can beat up on Mexico, but you can't beat up on both. And we think that you're going to beat up on China first, and this is going to play to Mexico's advantage. So we're going to sit tight. We're going to build our manufacturing capacity. We're hoping that other companies will build their manufacturing capacity in Mexico because we're meant to be friends. And friend-shoring is supposed to be the trend of 2025 and onward. And so we'll see whether Trump can sort of bully his way through foreign policy, economic policy, and the way he deals not just with enemies, but also with his friends.
We look at that idea of friend-shoring, David, and in the context of the world getting nastier and more bullies being in charge, and one wonders whether the bullying attitude is going to trickle down, whether it's going to inspire a whole new generation of young men and indeed young women to be like Trump, to be like Andrew Tate, to be like Vladimir Putin, because macho and sort of unreasonableness not necessarily completely sort of like not the same thing at all, but the idea that that strong means nasty at the minute, and yet you get this idea of friend-shoring that Chuck was talking about. Where are we looking at 2025, where we will see people pulling together and thinking, actually, we are going to fight for a little bit of decency? I mean, you think of post-war Europe. You have the European Union pulling together to ensure that, or the creation of the European Economic Community, trying to make sure that we never go to war again. Mm-hmm. And then we have NATO trying to say, look, build a big military alliance and it will ensure peace forever. Where do we see moments of friend-shoring coming from next year?
I really do hope so. Leadership in Europe will be central. The U.S. is going to be difficult and polarized in 2025. If the elite in Europe shows that they're worthwhile, people will respond to it. What's happening in many other places, as a little bit as Chuck, you're saying in Mexico, is the world's turning into a family where there's an abusive husband and the rest of us are abused wives and abused children. And abused wives and abused children spend a lot of time looking at the nasty man. Is he drunk or is he in a good mood? What's happening? What's the tone when he comes home? You cower. You always wait. There's a Lorena Bobbitt waiting in every abused wife. When you have a chance, you'll attack. There's no love towards the bully. When the bully shows weakness, he's obliterated. Our friends in Russia and China, they know that. And they know that from the way past leaders have been treated there. But think of the world as a terrified house, just a really nasty house after the guests have left. And we're alone with that abusive dad.
How terrifying, Chuck.
David's right, and this is going to be the year when Europe has to come to the rescue. When we thought about disruptive forces in geopolitics, we usually think about Russia, or we think about China, we think about Iran, or North Korea. In the coming year, the greatest disruptive force in geopolitics is going to be the United States. And the United States was once the most stable force in geopolitics. In fact, the world revolved around a sort of post-World War II American-built system. Resentment to that system is growing, and it's growing also inside the United States, and the cheerleader on all of that is Donald Trump. So all eyes on the U.S. as a disruptor. So what does that mean for Europe? That means that Europe, between the two poles of the United States and Asia, has got to do a lot of very important things. First, it has to learn how to defend itself without as much help from the United States as it is accustomed to receiving. Secondly, it has a lot of its own problems to solve. And that will focus, I think, in the coming year on a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. And whether Europe will step up, whether Europe will be at the table in those conversations, because this is the famous geopolitical saying: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we don't want Europe to be on the menu in negotiations that are held over its head between Moscow and Washington at the expense of Kiev and the rest of Europe. Europe's got to get its own house in order in France. It's got to do the same thing in Germany. It's got to push back against a resurgent radical right. There's a lot to do. But Europe is meant to be the global store of values. And the continent is going to have to emphasize those values, codify those values, and export those values around the world when its typical ally may no longer do that.
Well, before we forget, thank you very much indeed for that, David and Charles. Before we move on to some of the stories from this weekend's papers, let's take a final look at 2024. Here's Andrew Muller with his take. What we learned this year.
We learned this week that the producers had been having ideas again, but happily we just recently recorded an appropriate reaction chorus.
Awful.
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 Awful. Awful.
Don't know how we've gone this long without that. We learned that, once again, it being, in fairness, that time of year, we had been commanded to stretch our remit from what we had learned in the last 7 days to what we had learned in the last 12 months. We learned, and by way of a somewhat brisk retort from the producers, that, tempting though it was, we couldn't just gesture towards 2024's headlines and reply what we learned was clearly absolutely bloody nothing as usual and attach an invoice, and set, therefore, to work. So, without further ado, actually, you know what? We recorded that whole thing of further ado as well, and really haven't had as much use out of it as we expected. So, with further ado...
I can't remember if I left it really nice and plugged in. I took a photo of it when I plugged it out.
I really like
I'm actually quite worried.
I don't know if it's the season. Do you know, I want to say the thing about Hope is that green is more dark enough for is too dark.
Here is what we learned in 2024.
Come on. Just get on with it.
Settle down. We learned this year of a general discontent among the citizens of the democratic world, more of whom than ever in a single calendar were asked to vote. We learned that, by and large, they were of a mind to remove, eject, oust and or defenestrate the incumbents. We learned that the voters of the United Kingdom did not wish to run any risk of a sixth consecutive Conservative Prime Minister or the associated psychodramas, and instead were keener on a stint of being governed by someone you can just sort of have on in the background.
You have in the past, and I apologise for saying so, been called boring. Given what's happened in the markets, given what's happening in politics at the moment, is it actually time for Mr. Boring?
If anybody thinks that a government that loses control of the economy is somehow exciting, I think they need to go and speak to the people who will be looking at their mortgages today, looking at prices today, now looking at their pensions today, and say that they think that sort of excitement is what they want.
Conversely, we learned that on the Atlantic's other shore, voters had apparently had quite enough of earnest, diligent, if arguably somewhat plodding governance and the associated roaring economy, record figures for new business startups and investment in manufacturing, barely noticeable unemployment and so on, and instead wanted 4 more years of...
Now we're called Nazis, and I'm called Hitler. I'm not Hitler.
Always reassuring when a candidate for political office feels it necessary to be clear on that one. So one thing we learned this year is that we are, as a planet and as a species, going to spend another 4 years wondering if today is going to be the day that Donald Trump tries to name the months of the year after his children, appoint one of his shoes ambassador to Albania, or order the annexation of the moon, though none of these options make much less sense than putting the nation's health in the hands of this guy.
I was hitchhiking home from that party, and an older boy picked me up who I knew, and he offered me some LSD. And I had never taken any kind of drug before. I wouldn't have taken it, but I had a real deep interest, intense interest in paleontology. And I said to this guy, I said, if I take this, will I see dinosaurs? And he said, you might.
I see
We learned basically that the United States is once again going to more or less write the Friday What We Learned monologue for us for the foreseeable future, for which we don't wish to appear ungrateful, but we are, so that's often how it comes across. Anyway.
If I could save time in a bottle.
Reviewing our own year's labours in an effort to discern some coherent pattern in what we have chronicled, we failed, if we're honest, to locate much in the way of an anchoring theme of 2024. But we learned that this was the year that, to pluck some examples from the archive, come on, let's have a sense of occasion. We learned that boffins had used AI to make it possible to speak to dodos for some reason.
Hello, how are you?
Jack, welcome back. Reviving the dodo is a thought-provoking notion.
So there was that. And we learned that Botswana had threatened to invade Germany with 20,000 elephants. We learned that Canadians were having to be told not to let moose lick their cars. We learned that the Taliban had banned Kim Jong-un's haircut. We learned that North Korea had banned the trousers of a middle-aged British presenter of gardening programs. And we learned that you can't get hornets drunk. Mostly, though, we learned that there really is little in this life as satisfying as wasting the time of your extremely busy colleagues by herding them en masse into the studio, getting them to do things like argue over how you spell Liechtenstein.
What even is Liechtenstein? Do you even spell it that way? Am I saying it right? Can we annex it?
There's definitely a violent end in there.
What
even is the point?
Or debate Britain's class structure in terms of its supermarkets.
It's definitely
no.
I think M&S should get
Or asking the producers to make a sad trombone noise but in bovine mooing, which was another thing we did, something relating to some Spanish cow contest or whatever. Or the sound of a toucan tripping over an accordion and falling down a well into a pile of banjos, which probably also seemed important at the time. All in all, we learned as ever that human history is more a series of stumbles forward than a purposeful march, and that there really is nothing so silly that people will not think it, do it, say it, or elect it, all of which keeps leadenly whimsical news reviews such as this in steady business. Nevertheless, we wish all our listeners a very happy 2025, as do the folks in the General Muttered Agreement crew. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew will be back in 2025 with a weekly update of what we learned. Listening to that, David Bodanis and Charles Heck are my guests on Monocle on Sunday today. It's 9:44 here in London. I know that there was a return of a talking dodo just then, David, but you wanted to talk to us about, well, indeed, we also talked about the new health minister, the new health secretary in the United States wanting to see dinosaurs well off his head on LSD. You want to see woolly mammoths, and you don't even need to take any acid to do so, because it's in the Financial Times this weekend.
Yeah, so the question is, if we can use old DNA to either construct woolly mammoths entirely from scratch or modify elephants to give birth to things that are like woolly mammoths, should we? Reason to do it. It's fair to the things that were fun. And like how you like those nice thick rugs to rub your fingers in. This would be to the nth degree. You could say, well, it's fair. Humans got rid of them, so we can bring them back. You could say it's unfair. You bring one around, and is a woolly mammoth just for Christmas? I have to ask you, what do you do with it?
Don't you need to make two?
Yeah, and also its environment and the world around it. It's unclear whether it's the right thing to do. What do you think, Chuck?
Well, bring back all the woolly mammoth that you like, but just keep them away from Shoreditch, is all I can say.
Well, no, they have wonderful nails if they go to Shoreditch.
Can you imagine?
Woolly mammoths, they'll have to have new tusk bars.
Yeah. There is something fascinating about this. The world may not be ready for the reemergence of woolly mammoths. I mean, they became extinct for a reason. But perhaps it's a good idea to have these things in your back pocket just in case. And you'll know that of course,
pretty big pocket, Chuck, if you've got a woolly mammoth.
Just the DNA and just a little bit of genetic coding in your back pocket. Because we do, of course, maintain a seed library buried in the Arctic ice that would repopulate the world with all of its agriculture in the event of some sort of global catastrophic wipeout. And so maybe it's not a bad idea to sort of have an animal library.
This is actually very wise. So there's some animals, for example, that don't get cancers. There's some animals that the blood doesn't have lymphomas, even though otherwise the blood's very similar to us. We don't know exactly why. The answer is in a mixture of the DNA and their environment, but a lot of it's in the DNA. So it's really why. So some of the breast cancer treatments come from the bark of certain trees. If those trees were gone, we'd have no way to have worked it out later. So absolutely, let's preserve it.
I don't know how I would feel if I were an elephant being modified, as you just described, like the modification of an elephant. You have to work out the steps that need to be taken to revive these things. And I hope dearly that if you defrost some of these seeds, that they will actually sprout and spring to life, and they won't have just been I know what's in the back of my freezer. I'm not entirely sure it will spring to life anytime soon. But the idea of the steps that are necessary and the decision process that's made as well. I mean, who's in charge of saying, okay, we'll modify that elephant and we'll bring back that tree and we'll do this?
That's actually one of the key points. A lot of times people who pay very little tax will be excited to give a lot of money for a new scanning unit at a hospital. They can put their name on it, and it's like £1 million or £10 million. But what they won't do is pay ongoing taxes for maintenance, basic research, medical training, and nurse staffing on the weekends. So bringing back the woolly mammoth is exciting, and you can focus on it. But there's all sorts of maintenance of ecosystems in Africa and Central and South America, which I think would have a much greater effect on the environment. They're less sexy, but super useful.
Chuck, let's talk about some other stories that you've picked up this weekend. What's caught your eye?
Well, we've been talking about leadership. We've been talking a little bit about dictatorship. And so we've landed on a piece about Elon Musk.
Excellent.
And that is a piece from Politico that says, Musk calls AfD last spark of hope for Germany in op-ed in Welt. And this is referring to an opinion piece that Elon Musk has written and was published in the Welt am Sonntag newspaper in Germany, which is a sister publication of Politico, and they've declared that openly. And what he did was he went all in on Alternative for Germany, the AfD, the extreme right-wing party in Germany that is surging in popularity, and a country that is also facing elections after a no-confidence vote in Chancellor Olaf Scholz. This article, this op-ed piece, prompted the resignation of the opinion editor of the Welt am Sonntag, so a fairly high-profile reaction to a very, very high-profile piece. And you wonder why an authority figure in the United States, who of course has extensive business interests in Germany, would go all in on the far right. And again, this is the sort of thing that we're going to have to, I think, get used to, but try to avoid normalizing going forward.
This is a big question, isn't it? The normalization of allowing. I mean, one questions already the relevance of Elon Musk to write political op-eds on far right parties in Germany. I mean, you sometimes sort of want to you question the relevance and the expertise of that individual. But what I found very interesting about this story was, as you mentioned, that one of the senior editorial figures has resigned, and quite a lot of Die Welt yesterday was spent sort of absolutely examining its navel, going, why have we done this? There's about 2 or 3 articles by senior editorial figures who said, we discussed this before we published it, and they went ahead and did it, and half of us didn't want it to happen.
It's courtly politics. When you have somebody like Trump, you go back to the politics of medieval courts. It happened in the Muslim world and the Western world and stuff. What counts above all is what the ruler wants. He could be mad. He could be wanting to put his horse on the throne. He could have friends around. That's why the wife or mistresses or the best friends are incredibly important. So I think the reason they did it is because Musk is one step away from the decisions or at the decisions that are going to affect Germany profoundly. So they wouldn't have done it if he was just another rich businessman.
And let's cast our minds back a little bit to when you were in Moscow at the Moscow Times. When you were talking, were there moments when characters who knew full well were probably pretty dangerous, and you discussed the sort of like the oxygen given to them in the Moscow Times? So how much of that was an issue?
Well, I think about the way we at the Moscow Times and the way newspapers around the world covered Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was also an extremist politician and a political disruptor in Russia, and whose thumb on the electoral scales in Russia, such as they are, elections in Russia are deeply, deeply corrupt and rigged. And Zhirinovsky was a Kremlin creation designed to siphon votes away from the communists and the Communist Party. But he was an absolute raving lunatic. And that was sort of part of his charm and part of what made for great pictures and made for great sort of rich, characterful coverage. But he was the leader of a political party and a disruptive political party at that. He was profiled by every newspaper, by every magazine, famously by Playboy magazine in the 1990s. And, was not a serious politician, but got far more ink than leaders who were much more serious than him.
And you talk about the idea of the courtly attitude and the fact that Musk is close to Trump, David. What are the techniques that he's using in the way that he communicates to the outside world, which sort of belies what kind of character he is?
Musk's technique? Yeah. So in that previous book, The Art of Fairness, I spent a long time looking at Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda chief in Germany in the 1930s. Steve Bannon made a great study of Joseph Goebbels because these techniques really were very effective. Goebbels was somebody who was unpopular as a kid. He had various physical deformities. He was picked on, but he was quick-witted. So he got used to really twisting things back against the bully, became really smart. Many humorists are from that. Goebbels tried to be nice at one point in the way that Musk tried to be nice at one point. Goebbels actually had a Jewish girlfriend in his 20s. He was trying to write theater and this and that. But he shifted because there was a real pleasure with power. So one of the things he did is, just like Musk and Trump, he would mock other people. He would mock them. And the pleasure with mocking is, A, the people on your side. Whenever there's a bully in secondary school, look where the bully stands and where most of the kids in the school stand. Most of the kids in the school stand with the person who's doing the bullying. So if you mock somebody else, you get people on your side because they're scared. And also, if you mock somebody else, you have no reason to listen to them. When Musk says that, obviously, this German party is not bad, and the people who are against it are clearly stupid, you think, wow, they're so stupid, I don't have to engage with any of their reasons. People leave the Welt editorial page for no discernible reason. The other thing is to say that there's chaos without us. Without us, there's complete and utter chaos. That was the big line of Goebbels and many other people at that time. And Musk and Trump pushed that. Suppose it's actually true. We know, for example, that if you're in an emergency room in a hospital, if the doctor says death is right on this edge unless you do something, people rush to do it, stat. And you respond to that. And it's a call that human beings have to respond to, but can be, to use the current word, weaponized, to use poorly. Musk, unfortunately, is incredibly skilled at doing this.
He's very good at writing in very short sentences, which, as two authors, I'd be interested to know that. I think there's an article in Forbes this weekend that talked about how our concentration spans have absolutely been curtailed because of the joys of social media. Chuck, having written a book this year, did you sometimes think, I've got to make this shorter, otherwise people won't get it?
I did. And my publisher imposed a 100,000 word limit on the length of the book. And I initially thought, well, gosh, 100,000 words is an awful lot of words, until I finished the manuscript and it came in at 130,000 words.
That's not bad.
Well, that's 30% over the initial limit, and I thought it would really be sort of taking the biscuit if I sent in a manuscript that was 30% longer than they said I should write. At the end, I wrote 113,000 words after taking a scalpel, not even a scalpel, just an axe to the manuscript and sent it in 13% longer than it was meant to be. And I felt reasonably within the margin of error in doing that. The funny thing about writing a book that was 113,000 words is I'm in the process right now of writing a newspaper article that's supposed to be 1,200 words. And I'm finding it incredibly difficult. You would think that you could sort of bang that sort of thing out in your sleep, because I wrote more than 1,200 words a day typically. But it's a challenge. And as you've mentioned, the biggest challenge is trying not to be distracted by my phone every time I finish a paragraph. And it is an epic struggle.
And how about you, David? I mean, this article in Forbes talks about the benefits of actually sitting down and trying to get through a book. I think we're talking about English undergraduates who used to be given, three Dickens in a week to read. I come from that era. I didn't do it. But they're saying that the students are struggling to read one book a term now.
Yeah, if you just give out a tweet, you don't have to think of what other people are thinking. You just either give an attack or you give praise or whatever. But it's very, very direct. It's just one assertion. It loses the higher intellectual functions, the same sort of things that are lost when we drink alcohol or we smoke weed. Everything becomes so much easier because you don't have to assess what you're doing or think of the consequences. And there's a pleasure in that. Dostoevsky talked about it, the sheer joy of being wild and directly revealing it. A friend of mine is a really nice person who once reached her hand down to slap her child unnecessarily. And she thought in the moment that she was doing it, she thought, oh, what am I doing? But there was this moment of release just before, which is a terrible thing. A tweet can be that moment of release. Living in that realm of tweets, in the short term, very effective. And the long term, it loses what makes us skilled.
We've got 25 seconds, so in the space of absolutely no time at all, could you put your message out as to what you're doing in 2025, Chuck? Having just said that we should actually be diving a bit deeper.
2025, I hope, will be a year for another book.
Excellent.
And for the gradual assembly of what we call these days a portfolio career.
Excellent. How about you, David?
2025 is a year when I hope to publish a book with the exciting title, How to Change the World, Lessons from 3 People Who Did. Who are those 3 people?
Who are they?
One has to purchase it at retail and hardcover
to
find out.
You have to write it first, though. Have you done it?
The writing's done. The agents and publishers are going to act.
David Bodanis, Charles Hecker, thank you so much for joining me in the studio, and the happiest of New Year's to you. And a big thanks to all my guests and Tyler Brûlé as well, tromping through the snow in St. Moritz. Thanks to the producer, Desiree Bandley, and our studio engineer, David Stevens. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday returns next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend and a very happy New Year to you.